In 1206, a united confederation of nomadic tribes on the steppes of Central Asia crowned Temujin as Genghis Khan, universal ruler. This act heralded the birth of an empire that would, within a century, stretch across 22% of the Earth's land area, controlling over 100 million people, more than any other empire in history. Its swift rise was unprecedented, its brutality legendary, and its reach unparalleled. But like all empires, even one forged in fire and ambition, its immense power eventually fractured and faded. The popular narrative often cites internal strife, the vastness of its domains, and the overextension of its armies as primary causes. While these factors played a role, they conceal a more profound, biologically driven truth. The collapse of the Mongol Empire was fundamentally accelerated by the Black Death and endemic diseases, a catastrophic demographic shock that nobody truly mentions as the central, unifying reason. The Mongol Empire at its zenith was not a monolithic entity. Following Genghis Khan's death in 1227, the empire was divided among his sons and grandsons, gradually coalescing into four primary successor khanates: the Golden Horde in Eastern Europe and Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, and the Yuan dynasty in China. Each operated with increasing autonomy, often clashing with one another, yet they shared a common Mongol heritage and, crucially, a vast interconnected trade network, the revitalized Silk Road. This network, a conduit for wealth, ideas, and goods, inadvertently became the primary vector for the deadliest pandemic in human history. Let's first establish the empire's peak and the initial fissures. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol military machine seemed unstoppable. In 1241, the Golden Horde devastated European forces at the Battle of Legnica and the Battle of Mohi, reaching the Adriatic Sea. Hungary and Poland lay prostrate. Only the death of Ogedei Khan, Genghis's son and second great Khan, in December 1241, prompted the Mongol withdrawal to elect a successor, sparing Western Europe further invasion. This was an early sign of the inherent weakness in a vast empire. The immense geographical distances slowed communication and centralized decision-making, allowing opportunities to pass. Further campaigns by Hulagu Khan, another grandson of Genghis, led to the sack of Baghdad in 1258, ending the Abbasid Caliphate, a cultural and intellectual beacon for 500 years. The Ilkhanate's advance into the Levant was halted only at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260 by the Mamluks of Egypt, a rare and decisive Mongol defeat that marked the westernmost extent of their permanent expansion. In the east, Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson, conquered the Song dynasty in China by 1279, establishing the Yuan dynasty. His ambition extended to Japan, launching massive naval invasions in 1274 and 1281, both famously thwarted by typhoons, or kamikaze divine winds. These failures, particularly the colossal losses in the second invasion, drained immense resources and manpower, weakening the Yuan fleet and army. By the end of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire was at its territorial maximum, but the seeds of disunity were already sown. The War of Toluid Succession, 1260 to 1264, between Kublai Khan and his brother Arik Bokeh for the title of Great Khan, marked a definitive split, ending any pretense of a unified central authority. The four khanates, though culturally linked, now pursued independent policies, often engaging in fierce and destructive wars against each other, such as the decades-long conflict between the Yuan dynasty and the Chagatai Khanate, which severely disrupted trade and agricultural economies in Central Asia. These internal conflicts and military overextensions are the commonly cited reasons for collapse. However, they provided the cracks, while the coming pestilence would provide the hammer blow. The Black Death, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, originated in the marmot populations of the Himalayan foothills, specifically in the regions shared by the Mongol Empire, such as Yunnan, China, or the borderlands of Kyrgyzstan, which were core areas of Chagatai Khanate territory. Historical and genetic evidence points to an initial outbreak as early as the 1330s in Central Asia, long before its devastating sweep through Europe. The Mongols' extensive trade routes, specifically the Silk Road, which they diligently protected and even expanded to facilitate commerce, tragically became the perfect conduit for the plague. Caravan routes stretching from China through Central Asia, Persia, and the Middle East into the Crimea, and then to Byzantium and Europe, allowed the pathogen to travel with unprecedented speed. Consider the demographics. The Mongol Empire facilitated vast movements of people, animals, and goods. Armies of hundreds of thousands, merchant caravans numbering thousands of camels and horses, and the displacement of populations, all contributed to an environment ripe for disease transmission. The Mongols themselves, through their nomadic lifestyle and diet, had varying degrees of natural immunity to some regional diseases. Butyersinia pestis was a new, novel threat to which virtually no population had significant resist. Ants. The first major recorded outbreak linked to Mongol activity occurred in 1346. The Golden Horde, under Khan Jani Beg, was besieging the Genoese trading port of Kaffa, modern Feodosia, in Crimea. During the siege, the Mongol army was ravaged by a mysterious illness. Contemporary accounts, notably that of Gabriele de Mussi, an Italian notary, described the Mongols catapulting plague-infected corpses over the city walls to infect the defenders. While the effectiveness of this germ warfare tactic is debated by modern historians, the plague undeniably entered Kaffa. Genoese merchant ships fleeing Kaffa then carried the disease to Constantinople, then Alexandria, Cairo, Messina, and eventually across Europe, triggering the start of the European Black Death in late 1347. The impact of the Black Death on the various Mongol khanates was catastrophic, though specific demographic data is scarce due to limited record-keeping in these regions. However, indirect evidence and later historical accounts paint a grim picture. In the Golden Horde, the plague devastated urban centers and rural populations alike. The thriving cities of Sarai Batu and Sarai Burk, capital cities and major trading hubs on the Volga River, vital to the Horde's economy and administration, would have been particularly vulnerable. Historians estimate that the population losses in the Golden Horde could have been as high as 50 to 70% in some areas, comparable to the worst-hit regions of Europe. The sheer number of deaths led to a severe shortage of manpower, crippling the Horde's military and administrative capabilities. Taxation systems collapsed, trade routes were disrupted as merchants died or became fearful, and communication between regions broke down. This demographic catastrophe severely weakened the Golden Horde, leading to prolonged periods of political instability known as the Great Troubles, 1359 to 1380s, where numerous khans ascended and were quickly deposed. This internal chaos prevented any concerted military campaigns and exposed the Horde to external pressures, particularly from the rising Grand Duchy of Moscow and the Lithuanians. The decline of the Golden Horde is inextricably linked to the demographic void created by the plague. The Ilkhanate in Persia faced a similar fate. After a period of relative stability under Ghazan Khan, R. 1295 to 1304, and Oljaitu Khan, R. 1304 to 1316, who both pushed for greater integration into Persian society and embraced Islam, the Khanate began to weaken. Abu Sa'id Bahadur Khan, the last effective Khan, died in 1335, possibly from the plague itself or a similar epidemic, ushering in a rapid succession of child khans and figureheads. The Black Death reached Persia around 1347 to 1348, sweeping through the populous cities like Tabriz and Isfahan. The scale of mortality was enormous. Contemporary Muslim historians recorded devastating death tolls, indicating that entire cities were depopulated. The economic infrastructure, already strained by incessant inter-Mongol wars and administrative corruption, completely shattered. Without human labor, agricultural output plummeted, tax revenues evaporated, and public services disintegrated. This demographic collapse was not merely a contributing factor, it was a fundamental disconnector, dismantling the Ilkhanate's already fragile administrative apparatus and leading directly to its complete fragmentation into numerous smaller, competing local dynasties, such as the Jalayirids, Chobanids, and Muzaffarids. These successor states were a shadow of the Ilkhanate's former power. Further east, the Chagatai Khanate, situated directly on the Silk Road's critical central artery, was one of the first and most severely impacted regions. The plague likely festered here for decades before its global spread. The nomadic nature of many Chagatai Mongols, while seemingly offering some protection, also meant that outbreaks could quickly spread across vast pastures. The already unstable political situation, characterized by ongoing conflicts between the eastern and western branches of the Khanate, was exacerbated by monumental population decline. The plague's devastating effects on manpower led to a breakdown of social order, widespread banditry, and a significant weakening of the central authority. Control became localized and fragmented. It was in this chaos that Timur, or Tamerlane, would rise later in the century, consolidating power from the remnants of the fractured Chagatai domain. Building his empire on the ashes of widespread depopulation and instability. The Yuan dynasty in China also experienced catastrophic population decline, contributing significantly to its eventual downfall. While traditional historical accounts often emphasize Chinese rebellion, particularly the Red Turban Rebellion, as the primary cause of the Yuan's overthrow in 1368, the plague played a crucial, often underemphasized role. The Black Death arrived in China earlier than in Europe, likely in the 1330s or early 1340s. The dense populations of China's agricultural heartland and bustling cities, like Beijing and Hangzhou, were highly susceptible. Estimates vary, but some historians suggest that China's population may have declined by 30 to 50% during the mid-14th century, from approximately 120 million to 60 to 80 million. This was not solely due to the plague. A series of devastating famines, floods, particularly the massive Yellow River flood of 1344, and political corruption during the late Yuan period also contributed. However, the plague often struck populations already weakened by famine, making them even more vulnerable. The demographic collapse had profound consequences for the Yuan dynasty. The loss of vast numbers of peasants meant a drastic reduction in agricultural revenue, leading to financial crises for the imperial court. It also meant a severe shortage of new recruits for the army and a depletion of the labor force needed for infrastructure projects. The ability of the Yuan government to maintain order, collect taxes, and suppress local rebellions was severely compromised. The social fabric frayed, distrust between the Mongol ruling class and the Han Chinese peasantry deepened, and the mandate of heaven was perceived as having been lost. The widespread suffering and reduced population density created conditions highly favorable for the desperate and dispossessed to join rebel movements. The Red Turban Rebellion, which ultimately led to the establishment of the Ming dynasty under Zhu Yuanzhang, gained traction rapidly in a society weakened and demoralized by decades of plague, famine, and misrule. Why is the Black Death often relegated to a secondary role in the narrative of the Mongol Empire's collapse, particularly when discussing the Khanates of Asia? One reason is the Eurocentric bias in historical documentation. The plague's impact on Europe is extensively chronicled in Latin, Italian, and other European languages, with vivid personal accounts and detailed church records. In contrast, records from the Mongol Khanates, particularly the nomadic Golden Horde and Chagatai Khanate, are less abundant and often more difficult to translate and interpret for Western scholars. Persian chronicles, such as those of Rashid al-Din, provide valuable insights, but are often less focused on the granular demographic impact of disease than on political events and court intrigues. Chinese records, while extensive, often attribute societal collapse though the loss of the mandate of heaven and corruption, with plague and famine being seen as symptoms rather than primary drivers, though they were meticulously documented. Furthermore, the Mongol Empire's fragmentation began before the Black Death's onset. The War of Toluid Succession in 1260 to 1264, the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, and the failed invasions of Japan in the 1270s and 1280s all underscored internal weaknesses and military limitations. These political and military events provide clear, tangible narratives of decline that historians find easier to grasp and explain than the more insidious, pervasive, and less directly observable impact of disease. They fit neatly into traditional models of imperial collapse, overextension, internal strife, and external pressure. However, viewing the collapse solely through these lenses misses the critical accelerant. The Black Death didn't initiate the empire's decline, which had already begun with its partition in the 13th century, but it dramatically hastened and cemented the end of Mongol dominance in a way that nothing else could. The plague transformed existing cracks into chasms. It wasn't just a reduction in overall population, it was a targeted removal of the very people crucial for the empire's functioning: soldiers, tax collectors, administrators, merchants, and most importantly, agricultural laborers. Without these, the mechanisms of power grinding to a halt were inevitable. Imagine the logistical nightmare. An empire built on rapid movement, communication, and highly centralized control during military campaigns suddenly found itself with diminished personnel, disrupted communication lines, and a paralyzed economy. The Golden Horde needed a robust tax base from its Russian and steppe subjects to maintain its military and political influence. The Ilkhanate relied on its Persian agriculturalists and urban centers. The Yuan dynasty depended on the immense rice paddies and industrial output of China. When plague ravaged these populations, the foundations crumbled. The effects were not just direct mortality. The plague led to widespread social unrest, paranoia, and religious fervor. Trade, the lifeblood of the Mongol peace, Pax Mongolica, that unified the four khanates, was devastated. Roads became dangerous, markets emptied, and currencies lost value. This economic collapse, triggered by demographic catastrophe, further weakened the already strained relationships between the various Mongol factions and made effective governance nearly impossible. Local warlords and nascent anti-Mongol movements found fertile ground in the power vacuum and widespread despair. Consider the distinct impact on military might. The Mongol army, while smaller than popular myth suggests, often exaggerated by fearful Europeans, was extraordinarily effective due to its discipline, mobility, and superior tactics. However, maintaining this army required a continuous supply of manpower, trained horses, and logistical support. The plague decimated populations from which these soldiers were drawn and disrupted the pastoral economy that supplied the horses. A weakened military could no longer project power effectively, whether to suppress rebellions or to extract tribute. This dramatically accelerated the dissolution of Mongol authority, particularly in the peripheries where control was already tenuous. By the mid-14th century, the era of Mongol global dominance was undeniably over. While the Ming dynasty overthrew the Yuan in China in 1368, and the Grand Duchy of Moscow slowly chipped away at the Golden Horde's power, these outcomes were not merely the result of superior military or political strategies. They were the reaping of a demographic whirlwind. The forces that drove the Ming to power were often desperate peasants, whose communities had been ravaged by disease and famine, and who felt abandoned by a distant, failing Mongol government. The rise of Moscow was against a Golden Horde that was a shadow of its former self, torn by internal strife and population collapse. The impact also extended to the long-term political landscape. The demographic shock of the Black Death created conditions for new political entities and power structures to emerge. In Central Asia, the weakened Chagatai Khanate gave way to the Timurid Empire. In the Middle East, local dynasties found opportunities to assert independence from the fragmenting Ilkhanate. In Eastern Europe, the resurgent powers of Moscow and Lithuania effectively began the process of dismantling the Golden Horde. These new powers often arose from populations that, while also suffering, were perhaps less directly dependent on the Mongol imperial structure or found ways to adapt to the new desolate landscape. In conclusion, while the traditional explanations for the Mongol Empire's decline, vastness, internal divisions, military overextension, and local rebellions, are valid and played their part, they function as proximal causes. The ultimate, overarching, and often understated reason is the biologically devastating impact of the Black Death and concurrent epidemics. The interconnected Pax Mongolica, designed to foster trade and communication, inadvertently acted as a superhighway for Yersinia pestis. The subsequent demographic collapse, a loss of 30 to 70% of the population in various khanates, fundamentally undermined the very foundations of the empire: its manpower, its economy, its administrative capacity, and its military might. It shattered the social contract, crippled governance, and created a power vacuum that facilitated secession and external conquest. This wasn't just A contributing factor, it was the decisive, unifying force that irrevocably fractured and ultimately brought down the greatest land empire the world has ever seen. The silence around its central role in historical narratives often obscures this uncomfortable truth. Even the most formidable empires can be toppled, not by armies, but by microbes,